Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Humanism Now, the new podcast from the Central London Humanists. I'm your host, James, and this week we'll be talking about what it means to be Black, British and humanist in the UK today, an update on the government's ban on conversion therapy, and just what does it mean to be spiritual and non-religious. Plus our interview with Professor Christopher Cameron. And to discuss this, I'm delighted as ever to be joined by our regular guest, AJ from Central London Humanists, Young Humanists, Humanist International. AJ, I think it's getting to the point where we should probably just mention the groups that you're not involved with.
Just AJ's fine. Yeah. Hi, James. Glad to join you.
And also this week, I'm delighted to introduce a new guest, Audrey Simmons, a colleague at Central London Humanists and one of the co-leads of the Association of Black Humanists covering all of the UK. Welcome, Audrey.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I think it'd be great if you could just give our listeners a bit of an introduction to yourself and perhaps your personal journey to humanism.
Wow. Thank you, James. Thank you, AJ. As I say, my name is Audrey Simmons, and I am one of the co-leads of Association of Black Humanists, an organisation that's been around for about 10 years, working in the humanist community with a particular focus on the African Caribbean, and the diaspora of the people who have left religion, thinking of leaving religion, and kind of looking at all the issues that go with being from countries such as Nigeria or the Caribbean, where leaving religion is not just a case of just sort of deciding not to go, where there are other issues culturally and sort of being part of that community. So that's our focus. We've been doing this, as I say, for around 10 years, just trying to make humanism a little bit more comfortable and making people aware that there is such a thing as Black humanists, Black non-believers, Black freethinkers. And that is mainly our aim in the kind of work that we do, in the kind of events that we put on, and the kind of talks that we give, is to just generally repeat that point. I myself started out as I suppose I've had a mix of religions and upbringing. I went to a Church of England school, but my family were Seventh-day Adventists, so I ended up going to church on Saturdays and Sundays, which is probably why I'm a little schizophrenic in terms of religion. And so being raised in that kind of environment, sort of focusing on the end of times. I think anyone who's a Seventh-day Adventist kind of focuses on Revelations. So they're all that kind of sort of end of times kind of religion. Leaving that, I stopped going sort of to church quite early on, but still had to be involved because of my family. So I had to kind of still be going quite regularly. And it's been a kind of slow unpacking, unpicking of religious rituals and things that we kind of have to do as non-believers once you've been raised in a religious household. So it's taken me a long time to kind of get to the point where I can feel comfortable in saying I am a Black person, I am from a religious family, but I am a non-believer. And I think that's the story of many people from my community, many Black people from my community. And it's a long, slow process. There's no epiphany. There's none of that. It's just kind of taking the time to read, to think, and then to feel comfortable. And then facing the challenges that some people do face when having made that decision to be no longer involved within the religious community.
And do you think there are some unique challenges for Black people who are either coming out as non-believers or want to proactively state that they're humanists?
There are definitely unique challenges. I think when we look at the Black community, it has been depicted and still is a heavily religious community. So wherever part of Africa you come from, wherever part of the Caribbean you come from, being religious and religion is part of the fabric of society. If we think of where I'm from Jamaica. If we think of the Caribbean, the very fabric of the whole foundation of those societies, once slavery was over, was being controlled by religious organizations and religious institutions, whether it be the Catholic Church, the Moravian, the Quakers, Baptists. A whole range of organizations would then sweep in. So the whole backdrop to the Caribbean life was about religion in terms of education, in terms of health, all of those things. And if we look in Africa now, the Catholic Church is one of the biggest churches providing healthcare and education within Africa. And so, again, we have this big backdrop of religion. So if you speak to many religious people, many African people, religion plays an enormous part in their lives. And we just need to keep that voice out there, because obviously we know that in Nigeria, with sort of Islamic and Christian beliefs being there, there are real troubles, real problems with people being arrested and things like that. So the Black community has particular issues that I think that don't exist within the wider European community.
Yeah, I just like to pick up on something that Audrey said there about just being visible and allowing that possibility in people's minds that they can leave their faith, especially when it's so embedded in your life. I know that some of our colleagues from, say, Faith to Faithless, which is another part of Humanists UK, and they work a lot with apostates, for example, from the Muslim background. And I've had Muslim apostates say to me, I wasn't even aware that it was a possibility to leave Islam. And it sounds a bit odd. It's just a belief system. You in our Western, fairly liberal bubble, we can, to an extent, although there are some extreme elements also here, you can buy into or buy out of, join and leave belief systems, groups. We have a different relationship with religion to other people in other parts of the world. So having that possibility, having that visibility, like, oh, there is a Black Humanist Association, or there is a ex-Muslims Association, having that as a possibility, just putting that banner up for people who may be quite cut off in their family neighborhoods, in their kind of cul-de-sacs of society, enforced cul-de-sacs, because that's how they retain control. Because of that, having a visibility for a group like Black Humanists, I think, is really important.
Yes, I think I'm not a quiet person. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm not one of those people that just sit down and just kind of think, well, this is where I am. I am a kind of person that would need to step forward and say and shout out very loudly that this is a possibility. And AJ, I think you raised a really important point, that it's about just being aware that people can do this, that you can actually opt out. That's the hardest thing, especially when it's not just your culture and your community, it's your way of life. And it's a way of life that you've known all your life, and everyone around you has that same thinking. So, you have to get over the idea that you're actually a bit odd. You're the odd one out. Exactly. And dealing with all of that. And that can be quite, sort of, you become quite angst-ridden and, what's wrong with me? And usually find that people who leave usually become much more religious in that kind of quest to kind of think, why am I strange? Why am I not like the rest of my family? And I think that's an important thing to remember, that people are going on a journey, and that journey is quite traumatic. So, yeah, because they're losing so much.
Actually, one question that we had coming out of last week's episode was just for perhaps more of a precise definition or specific definition of humanism. And I was just wondering, Audrey, you mentioned, you're not want to stay quiet. So it's not just a case of leaving faith and quietly, not being a believer. And I just wondered, what for you was the reason why you wanted to come out as a humanist and be publicly facing and present and say, I am a humanist? And what does humanism mean to you that is not there in just being a non-believer?
The reason I wanted to come out is to give people that choice. I think one thing that's lacking in Black communities and African communities is the choice to be who you want to be. We talk so much about it in there, your sense of identity and all of these things. And I think if people don't actually know that they can actually be a non-believer. But more importantly, what I think humanism offers is the understanding that you can leave religion and still be okay, that you can still be kind, moral, and all the rest of those things that have been so caught up with religion that they've taken over the idea that if you are not with them, that you are somehow the worst human being ever. And I think that causes the angst. Well, who am I if I am not a Christian, if I am not a Muslim, if I am not a Seventh-day Adventist? Who am I? And I think humanism offers an answer to that. You are still, you're still a person, you're a human being, but it also offers that. For me, it's a relief. It's a relief not to be so angst-ridden about who am I allowed to be with, what kind of Christian can I be, what kind of Christian can I, be involved with. As a Seventh-day Adventist, the Catholic Church was the Antichrist. So there's all this angst about, how am I going to live my life? What's this Christian life supposed to be? Who am I supposed to be mixed with? Who am I supposed to be avoiding? And when you kind of let go of all of that, there's a sense of relief, and there's a sense of a way forward as a human being, and how you can reconnect with not just yourself, with your community, but with the wider world, when you suddenly realize that you're part of something much bigger, and that you have a contribution to make and a legacy to leave, even if it's not, you're not going to be on TV or famous, just the community that you are with, just to say, I am a humanist, I am here, and I'm living a life, I'm living a great life, and I'm in touch with every single one of you. And just have those kind of open and free conversations without restriction, for me, is what humanism represents.
Yeah. And AJ, how would you define humanism? What is it that you believe?
Thanks, James. Yeah, we mentioned this a bit last episode, and I think it's one of the characteristics of humanist discussions that we always seem to be defining humanism. We always seem to be picking away at it and lifting it up the rock and seeing what's underneath it. But I think that's actually demonstrating one of the hallmarks of humanism is critical thinking, is investigation, is a willingness to re-examine our own precepts, our own axioms, and just trying to get it trimmed down to the essentials and the core, and revisiting our worldviews and refreshing them is, I think, one hallmark of humanism that, as we mentioned in episode 1, many other belief and faith systems don't share. We can include the link to the Declaration on Modern Humanism from Humanists International, and I was there when it was voted in Glasgow. This is the follow-up to, or the new version of, the Amsterdam Declaration, which had existed for some time before that, many years. And that really boils down to its core, the 4 main points of what, in Humanists International and their members' view, but it is quite representative globally, what humanism is, and what humanism and what humanists strive to be. They strive to be rational, which means using evidence-based reasoning and scientific methods, which we think is the best empirical tool we have for investigating the world around us. Striving to be rational using the scientific method, striving to be ethical and empathetic, and within all of that is concern for the natural world, for sentient organisms generally, or striving to be democratic as well. And especially we see in a world that's heavily dominated by populist politics, we're questioning ourselves as to what democracy is. Is it mob rule? Is it not? So a reference to a democracy was also there. And the reference to empathy also attacks this idea of maybe being just an atheist, or maybe even being a nihilist. So we're not, so as Audrey said there, with her background and what she's bringing to the humanist experience and her path, living well and showing that you can have a full, fulfilling life, full of wonder, full of love, mystery. I mentioned my humanist spirituality connections in episode 1. We may come to that a bit later. All of those things she mentioned about living a full life and not living a half life, which is the propaganda that we sometimes get from others about humanists and atheists. That also is there, living a fulfilling life, full of human flourishing, human creativity, and free expression. So those 3 or 4 points there is what we find in the Declaration of Modern Humanism, and so that's also how I'd respond to that.
Thank you both so much. But just before we move on, Audrey, if anybody is interested to get involved or join the Association of Black Humanists, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
We use Meetup for all our events and making contact with any members. And that's where we are. So a Meetup Association of Black Humanists.
It's also been a very busy week for AJ and some members of the LGBT Humanists, Young Humanists and other Humanist UK groups, having a day trip down to Parliament to put some pressure on the Prime Minister. AJ, could you give us an update on the campaign that you've been involved with?
Yeah, so we're fresh off a demo yesterday at Parliament Square in front of the House of Lords and House of Commons. And this was in relation to the ban on conversion therapy in the UK. So maybe we could start off with some background just very briefly. Conversion therapy, as many listeners may know, is a kind of diverse set of practices religiously associated in many cases, part of, as we mentioned before, when we looked at Audrey's story, in the settings of churches and other family and other worship groups, where there is a set of religious and maybe slightly even pseudoscientific practices that aim to, for example, quote unquote, pray away the gay, exorcisms, and other kind of practices that are made, are targeted at quite vulnerable and often quite young people who maybe from a religious background, but their families are disapproving of their sex and gender identity and orientation and preferences. So this is a human rights abuse, a grave human rights abuse. It's an international scandal, really, that we try and have a moral authority on an international scene, but yet we can't even get our own house in order and try and allow for these basic human rights, breathing spaces to exist. So 5 years ago, the government committed to or announced that it's going to introduce legislation to ban conversion therapy in the UK. Since then, there's been, as we know, tumultuous period for many reasons in the UK, but still, I think, politics aside and partisan politics aside, this is a grave human rights issue and nothing's been done about it. There's been several U-turns. The latest that we got from it before yesterday or before the summer, which is what prompted us to go on this demo yesterday, was that there was a draft bill sitting with Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and I was waiting for his signature, but there's been no action taken on it. And actually, there's now the latest news is that it's been cancelled completely. So we wanted to go out there and really make this visible and raise the banner to say, and in allyship with Stonewall and many other partners who are also working to make sure conversion therapy is banned, that this is completely unacceptable. So we were there with LGBT humanist colleagues, Young Humanists UK, represented by myself, and also other Humanist UK volunteers. And we actually made it onto ITV national news, which was quite a good exposure for us, because this really, really is a key issue. And we just wouldn't be able to look our LGBT humanist colleagues and friends, in the eye if we don't do all we can to take action on this and to force the government to stick to their commitments.
I suspect a lot of listeners might be surprised that these practices are still happening in the UK. How prevalent is conversion therapy in the modern day?
Well, again, the UK government's own census data or research has shown when they've looked into the prevalence of this, that probably about 5 to 10%, I think maybe 7% was the figure, of LGBT plus people in the UK have undergone some form of conversion therapy. Again, it's a very wide, broad range of practices. And of that proportion of people, about half of them, or just over half of them, have had it done in a religious setting. So for us as Humanists UK, who are really the leading non-religious representative body and charity in the UK, that strikes at the very heart of our mission, because there's non-religious people or religious people who are doubting their faith or who find themselves in a position of vulnerability and who feel trapped. As I said yesterday at the protest when I was interviewed, they feel trapped in that situation. And also, as Audrey has described a bit with her background as well, when you have everyone around you making you feel like you're under the spotlight, like making you feel you've done something wrong and that you need to be cured, or that what you feel as a natural urge is just a lifestyle choice, there's vulnerable people there that day by day are still suffering. And the main theme of the protest yesterday, the demonstration, was abuse doesn't take a summer break. And we had a beach theme, and to try and really to put that in people's minds and to get that on social media and to try and increase the pressure on us as a society and the government who represents us to stick to their commitment.
You said the latest news is that it's being cancelled. Has that been officially confirmed, or is that just due to the substantial delays at this point?
Yeah, it's what's been reported. So in response to some of the news that we're hearing this week, but the government hasn't officially commented on it. But it seems like they're maneuvering, which wouldn't surprise us because that's the pattern of behavior that we've been seeing. Yes, no, and then delays. It just doesn't seem to be a priority for this government, which sells a lot, because we are, just to take a wider perspective on things, a global perspective, when we are trying to impose our diplomatic and moral authority internationally with, say, for example, Iran or Russia. And that's very important that we do that, and that we do try and represent these liberal values generally internationally, such as they are. If we're doing that, if we're trying to do that abroad, but even on our own shores, we can't even ensure the basic, someone's sexuality and someone's gender preference is one of the most personal things that you can possibly get. It's very, very important, and especially at a young age. Young humanists broadly are 18 to 35. That's kind of our remit for me as one of the coordinators of Young Humanists. But essentially, we should be looking at, we have school speakers, and we try to outreach education through educational campaigns. So we're concerned about humanists and potential humanists of all ages. And at that really young age, especially in the teenage age, in your early 20s, in the formative years, if you're not allowed to express your sexuality and gender in identity in the way that you naturally feel that you should be, that can be traumatizing for life. So apart from the moral authority it loses us diplomatically and internationally, there's also a really grave human rights abuse here that's being ignored. So yeah, it looks like it's trying to be deprioritized by this government, and there are some rumors that it could just be cancelled completely, and we can't let that happen.
Keep up that work. It's really hard. In the communities that I work with, in the African Caribbean community, homosexuality is still seen very much in line with religious values. And even if you're not particularly religious within the community, homosexuality is still one of the biggest taboos that we have going, and there's always an ongoing issue. And it's coupled with the idea of masculinity as well. So in some of these, the toxic masculinity that is also out there and it's quite prevalent. So, this combination of things within the community can be quite traumatic and can be life-changing. You will, again, if you're suspected of being gay, it can be, you can be ostracized, even whether you are or not. If if you're not masculine enough, just that hint of being gay or possibility can totally take over and destroy your life. So I think it's important that the work that Humanist UK and everyone that you're working with, AJ, continues that work and continues that voice being heard.
Yeah, I'd echo that. Thank you, AJ. And if, again, anybody would like to support that campaign or get involved, what would be the best way to contact you there, AJ?
Yes, this is one of our key campaigns as part of Humanists UK. You can go to humanists.uk, our website, or follow Humanists UK or LGBT Humanists and Young Humanists on socials.
Thank you. Now, as mentioned at the top of the show, we will next week be hosting our joint event with the Association of Black Humanists, and our guest speaker, I'm delighted to say, has joined us for an interview just to preview that talk. So here's my interview with Chris Cameron. Dr. Christopher Cameron is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina. He's the founder of the African American Intellectual History Society, the author of To Plead Our Own Case, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, and the co-editor of New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. His most recent book, Black Freethinkers, explores the history of secularism in the United States. Dr. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Humanism Now.
Thank you for having me.
It's an honor to have you on the show, and we're very much looking forward to hearing more about Black Freethinkers in your event with both our groups and SI Martin on the 22nd of September. But I think perhaps just to start, it'd be great to find out more about your your background and your personal journey to humanism, and what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, sure. So I had probably a somewhat unconventional path towards humanism. So I wasn't really raised traditionally religious. My mom's side of the family is French Catholics from Quebec, and they had migrated down to New Hampshire in the 60s. Growing up, I went to church once or twice a year, Easter, midnight mass, that type of thing, not really important. Every once in a blue moon, my mom would feel guilty about, not really exposing us to church. And oddly enough, she wouldn't bring us to a Catholic church. She would bring us to like some storefront evangelical church or something like that. We'd go for a couple of weeks and then, fall off. But I actually sort of turned more towards religion when I was incarcerated. So I got into dealing drugs when I was in high school. I got arrested in June of 2001, and I went to a county jail in Manchester, New Hampshire. And probably a week or a week and a half into my sentence, I remember I was reading this book called An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser about a young man who had committed a murder after achieving some success in life, and he's sitting in jail at the end and pondering his whole life. And I could kind of relate, not to the murder part, but to the sitting in jail and wondering, what have I done, and he accepts God at the end, and it's all good. And that kind of pushed me to do the same thing, right? I remembered some religious lessons from my grandmother growing up and got on my knees and did the whole, Jesus come into my heart and everything. And so I thought I was saved. I thought I was good to go. But it was kind of weird because after that, I immediately started questioning the entire thing. Well, am I really saved? How do I really know? Jesus didn't actually tell me or confirm that I am, So even, I was having doubts pretty soon after. I'd get out after 8 months in 2002, and I was basically forced by the state to attend religious recovery, right? Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. They say there you don't have to be religious, but it seemed pretty religious to me, like state sanctioned and forced religiosity. So I did that for a few years till I got off probation. Ended up transferring, going to college. And then transferring to a school out in Western New Hampshire. Wasn't really particularly religious there or anything. Then when I went to grad school, that's when I actually got into kind of formal religion, right? I started a PhD program in history at UNC Chapel Hill in 2006. And I was one of two Black PhD students in my cohort. And there just weren't a lot of other Black graduate students in general. And I was kind of searching for community, right? And I was also kind of wrestling with questions of my own identity and my own Blackness, being a mixed race person. So I ended up going to the AME Church in Chapel Hill, African Methodist Episcopal. I joined the church. I was pretty ardent for about 6 months. And then it just started to feel really empty to me, right? I didn't feel like I was going through all the rituals and the motions out of any innate desire. And I also started looking around and kind of questioning what was going on in the services. The same person catches the Holy Spirit at the same time in the sermon every single week. Why isn't the Holy Spirit more egalitarian? Why wouldn't he spread his holiness around to other people? Why is it the same dude at the same time every week? So then it started to feel really empty and kind of meaningless to me. And I just started realizing I didn't believe in this stuff. So, I was searching for a little bit. I went to the Quaker meeting in Chapel Hill for a while, and I could kind of get with that, right? Because it didn't seem religious. We would meditate, basically. Sometimes somebody would say something. Other times we would sit there for an hour, all basically just meditating together. And I was like, yeah, this is kind of cool. I was reading some Eastern religions and philosophy at the time. So, I could kind of get with that. And the Eastern philosophers I was reading, one in particular was Jiddu Krishnamurti. And I kind of came upon him by accident, just watching a movie and seeing a movie about Reuben Hurricane Carter. called The Hurricane, and seeing Reuben Carter reading this book by Krishnamurti while he was in his prison cell called The Awakening of Intelligence. So I went and I got the book, and I got a few of his other books. And Krishnamurti really attacks our belief and adherence to traditions and rituals simply for the sake of this is how it's always been done, right? And his books really show kind of how ridiculous it is to just believe in something for no other reason than this is how we've always believed, right? And so I don't think he was necessarily an atheist, and certainly not a part of the secular movement. But for me, he was like a sort of way station towards atheism and humanism, right? He got me thinking about just traditional Christianity and kind of questioning everything that I'd been taught. And from there, I would then discover some of the writings of, the new atheists, Susan Jacoby and Sam Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens and others. And I was immediately convinced, right? I just read them, and it just really made sense to me. The arguments against traditional conceptions of God and for evolution, and especially for the way that religion has harmed societies around the globe, and the critical damage that it's done, even from like religious moderates and some religious liberals, right, given sanction to some of the more extreme and radical forms of religion. So this was probably about my second going into my third year of graduate school, so looking at about 2008, 2009. By the time I finished my PhD in 2010, I was pretty fully identified as an atheist and a humanist. So that's kind of the sort of religious path for me.
Yeah, and I can see it's like at various points, different elements of the religion kind of get chipped away. It was interesting actually that, the ritual side of things, which I think is often seen as one of the positives of religion, that was the thing that you were turned against as well.
Yeah, it was strange. Just like stand up now, sing this song now. Like, I don't know. It just really kind of turned me off for some reason. Although that's not necessarily, and I think it might have been the rituals combined with the theology and the religious messages, because when I've attended, I guess, secular churches, if you will, one of which I was just at about a week and a half ago, the Houston Oasis down in Texas, I'm not turned off by, the kind of more churchier parts of this secular meeting, right? But I was in the context of a traditional church.
Do you feel like religion it continues to do harm in the US?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, we can see this with the religious right and its, close relationship to the very radical and leaning towards, if not already fascist, Republican political party in this country. And religion, looking specifically at, the African-American community, still continues to sort of harm us in terms of religious discrimination and just sort of religious sort of shaming of individuals. We see something like the recent Supreme Court decision that banned abortion, or that sort of overturned Roe versus Wade, not banning abortion, but overturned the decision, Roe versus Wade, and allowed states to now ban abortion at their level. Like, that's basically what the religious right has been fighting for years. And we're already getting reports of, women having to flee to other states and being afraid of being persecuted and prosecuted by authorities in their home states. Some states are trying to now make laws where if you travel to another state to get an abortion, you can be prosecuted. So, I mean, it really seems like we're moving towards some Handmaid's Tale type stuff in certain states. It's not at the national level yet, but the religious right certainly does want to ban abortion at the national level, even though they claim to believe in states' rights.
And was that rising threat part of your inspiration behind why now was the right time to write Black Freethinkers?
Part of the inspiration was, one, my own research into sort of religious discrimination against African Americans and even practitioners of African traditional religions. But it was also just my own kind of budding and growing identity as an atheist and as a humanist. So I had pretty much fully accepted atheism by about 2010. I finished my dissertation that same year. So I took a couple of years. I revised my first book. And then around mid to late 2012, I was looking for a new book project. And that's when I kind of also stumbled upon different blogs and some different Black organizations like African Americans for Humanism. I found Black non-believers and started connecting with some folks online. And on the blogs and websites of these organizations, I would see, individual profiles of particular Black freethinkers, right? A couple of paragraphs on Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes or somebody like that. So that started to pique my interest. I'd come across some of these and then go back, like a historian does, go back to the primary sources and, okay, well, you got this little excerpt of Zora Neale Hurston's secularism from this source. Let me go back and read the entire thing. And when I started to do this, I started to just think that, there really is something to, there being a significance of Black secularism in African-American intellectual and political history that doesn't really seem to have gotten a lot of attention from historians, right? We have, biographies of particular individuals, and as an afterthought, their agnosticism or atheism will be mentioned. But, I wasn't really finding that any historians had written, an overarching history exploring the importance of secularism in African-American life, whereas there are hundreds, if not thousands of books exploring the significance of religion in African-American life. So I thought something needed to be done about that. And so it was really just kind of a perfect confluence of my own individual interests and me being able to bring a key part of my identity, but also needing a second book for my job and needing to kind of keep publishing and the like, and finding that, this is an area that I could really make an important historical contribution.
And did you find that the roots of African American secularism were distinct from a lot of the narratives and stories that were being told about the rise in secularism generally, or is this very much a similar story that in terms of where these questions started to arise from?
Yeah, no, they're absolutely distinct. So if we're looking at the rise of secularism among white intellectuals and thinkers, like Thomas Paine and Jefferson and Ethan Allen and others, we really look to kind of two key sources. One is Enlightenment philosophy and the application of ideas about natural laws to religion and the sort of rise of deism called the religion of nature. And we also look to a lesser extent to the rise of kind of liberal Protestantism during the 18th century, sort of a forerunner to Unitarianism. So that could be sort of, again, kind of like Krishnamurti was for me, sort of a way station towards deism and secularism. That wasn't necessarily the case for African Americans because with the restrictions in just about all Southern colonies and then states after the American Revolution, most enslaved people were forbidden from learning how to read, right, and could face incredibly severe punishments for doing so. So they weren't necessarily as conversant with Enlightenment thinkers, but they were nevertheless intelligent individuals themselves who could, look at their world, reason, and kind of think about the ideas that they were hearing about the nature of the world, about religion, about the character of God, and they could come to their own conclusions based upon their experiences. And for most enslaved people, those experiences were suffering and brutality and physical punishment and separation from family and distress, right? Not to say that there weren't times of joy with the birth of a child or getting married or anything like that, But a central and critical component of slavery was the suffering, right? That's how it was maintained. So you had enslaved people who were like looking around and thinking, I can't believe that there's a just and, omnipotent and benevolent God who cares about my interests and who created this world, right? If there is a God, it must be one that hates Black people. But for many, it's just easier to believe that there's no God altogether. So you do see during the late 18th and throughout the 19th centuries kind of parallel developments of secularism, with white secularism being based largely on Enlightenment philosophy, and Black secularism sort of emerging out of the lived experiences and realities of slavery. Those two would come together a bit more in the later 19th and moving into the 20th century, when African Americans are able to access both secondary and higher education, when they are able to become more conversant with, Enlightenment thought. So curiously enough, you actually see, Rousseau and Paine and Montesquieu playing more of a role in Black secular development during the early 20th century than it did closer to the time period when they were writing. I found evidence of folks like Hubert Harrison and Harry Haywood in the early 20th century talking about reading these 18th century European philosophers and how they influenced their views on religion.
I wonder, were there any individuals whose stories really stood out for you in researching the book as perhaps people that we should know more about?
Yeah, absolutely. One is a woman named Louise Thompson Patterson. And when we think about, Black secularism, there are some figures that maybe do stand out, right? We might think, okay, Frederick Douglass, right? Or perhaps W.E.B. Du Bois, or looking at the civil rights era like Huey Newton, right? And a lot of the folks in the Black Panther Party. Louise Thompson Patterson is somebody who is much more kind of understated and hasn't received as much attention, but I was able to find a lot of evidence for her kind of growing secularism in an unpublished autobiography that she nearly completed and went through a few different drafts of, and is located in an archive at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And there she talks about her experiences with religious discrimination and racism growing up in Washington State, in Walla Walla, Washington, and other kind of smaller, more rural areas of Washington State in the early 20th century. She then attended the University of California, Berkeley, in the early 1920s, and would articulate her opposition to religion in sort of a number of different arenas in her life. She ended up being a really prominent member of the Communist Party, which really opened up a lot of opportunities for leadership for Black women that were not available to them within African American organizations, especially Black churches, right? So she was a really prominent communist organizer, an atheist and a free thinker, and she lived an incredibly long life. She lived till she was almost 100 years old, right? So she was around and friends with Langston Hughes in the Harlem Renaissance, and she lived into the early 90s. So she saw almost the entire arc of the 20th century, and was really critically involved in some key moments in Black political history. So, yeah, kind of finding that evidence about her was just really amazing. I actually went to Emory to work in the papers of Alice Walker, who I knew was a free thinker because she had won the Humanist of the Year award from the American Humanist Association. So I knew that, and I had access to that published speech. I went to work in Walker's personal papers just to read through all of her letters and see if there are other connections. And when I was talking about the archivist, he told me about Louise Thompson Patterson's papers. I'm like, all right. So that was a really great and exciting find for me.
It does seem like there's more female voices in this story than perhaps we usually hear in as I said, the European narrative of the Enlightenment right the way through to the new atheist movement. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a reason behind that?
Well, I tried to be really intentional about finding all of the evidence I could from from Black female freethinkers. And this is in large part motivated by the pioneering work of the contemporary female Black freethinker, Sikivu Hutchinson, whose books Moral Combat and Godless Americana I really just kind of ate up. And that kind of pushed me to look for, all the historical female Black freethinkers that I could, and to really just highlight their stories as much as possible, because you're right, they haven't really been told. So I tried to, include people like Patterson and Nella Larson and Hurston and others to show that they were, critically important in this history and really drivers at some points of the kind of conversations around Black secularism.
And I'm wondering, was there anything which you changed your mind from in researching and putting this book together? Was there anything you found particularly surprising?
The main thing was organizational. So I was going to, initially the book was going to go up to 2020, right? Black Freethinkers basically ends around the civil rights era, though. And then I have a afterword that kind of traces some of the history after 1975, but does so very sort of briefly and perfunctorily. And that's because as I started gathering materials for the post-civil rights era, I found that there was just so much that it was going to be too unwieldy of a final chapter, right? Even the last chapter of Black Freethinkers on the civil rights era, that was pretty long. I think it was close to 70 manuscript pages, right? And I had way more materials for the post-civil rights period. So I decided that I was going to write a second volume as a follow-up that just looked at the period from 1975 through 2020.
I wondered as well, what has the reception been like to the book? Now that it's been out and you've probably had a chance to get some feedback.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty good. I've been invited to give talks all across the United States. I've had good crowds at many of these events, and it's especially been well received by Unitarian Universalists, which is not a particularly diverse denomination, but they're very, very interested in the history of secularism and have really kind of eaten up this work on Black secularism. So that's probably the one kind of group that I've given more talks about Black freethinkers to than any other ones. But the reception I think has been pretty strong, from UU churches to secular organizations throughout the U.S. and some universities as well.
Well, that bodes well for the success of your next book, then, if the Universalists particularly keen. And what about the state of Black free thought since the book's come out? Have you seen? Do you think it's contributed to a rise?
I'm not sure my book has contributed to a rise, but I think there is already sort of a broader movement away from institutional religion within the United States. And the recent Pew Forum for the Study of Religion has kind of shown that shift in Black religious life and in American religious life more broadly. But I do think, for the audiences that I've spoken to, I have gotten a lot of feedback from people that said that, they never knew any of this history, and it sort of inspired them to kind of talk to their family about their own beliefs. So I do think on a kind of more individual level here and there, my book has had some impact, but I don't think I can necessarily take credit for sort of the larger trends that were already kind of in play before the book was published.
If anyone's interested in finding out more in this area, are there any other books you would recommend aside from your own?
Yeah, Michael Lackey has a book called African American Atheists and Political Liberation. It's very academic. It's kind of a literary analysis of some of the writings of early 20th century Black atheists, but it's a really great sort of in-depth look at sort of the development of Black atheist thought at the time. And then basically anything written by Anthony Pinn, who's been working in the area of Black humanism for nearly 3 decades now. I would especially suggest his edited collection, By These Hands, a documentary history of African American humanism, as well as his book, The End of God Talk, where he sort of works to develop in African American humanist theology. So yeah, Michael Lackey and Anthony Pinn. And Sakibu Hutchinson, who I mentioned earlier, has some wonderful works on the intersections of gender and Black free thought.
And if anyone listening would like to find out more, what would be the best way to get in contact or to follow you?
You can email me at christopher.cameron@charlotte.edu. It's my university email address, or you can look me up on Facebook. And I'll be happy to get back to you, and look forward to meeting a lot of folks listening to this next Friday.
Chris Cameron there. And as mentioned, you'll be able to catch Chris in conversation with S.I. Martin on the 22nd of September here in central London. Audrey, I know you've also read Chris's book, and I just wanted to get your initial thoughts on the interview and what you took from the book.
The interview was really nice to get a background on Professor Cameron and where he was coming from and where that book came from. The book itself, for me, felt quite seminal. It felt like we've been waiting for the context for Black free thought, and I think he was able to put that foundation in. It felt the kind of book that gave you all the background. We know some of the names. We knew W.E.D. Du Bois. We know Frederick Douglass. We know these names, but we know them in sort of snippets. We kind of know bits about their lives, and we think we know them. But I think for me, this book actually kind of puts them in context, and also lets you know that nothing happens in a vacuum. So by the time we get to James Baldwin, we have a whole history of people, starting from slavery all the way through, and that constant, relentless idea of free thought threading its way all the way through was quite empowering for me to be sitting there thinking, actually, we're standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of where we are now, sitting here in 2023, and how far this whole journey has come. So I felt quite, it was really empowering for me, and I really loved the book, and kind of felt that it's a kind of book that anyone coming new to humanism, you kind of go, you want to know where you come from here. We might make it sort of compulsory reading for ABH members or something like that.
Absolutely. And I think it's a shame we've got to wait another 3 or 4 years for volume 2, although it's good to know that it is coming down the tracks. AJ, what did you take away most?
For me, the global roots of humanism is something that kept coming to my mind listening to that interview. We mentioned it a bit in episode 1, and I think it really speaks to one of the aims that we want with this podcast. I mean, it's Humanism Now. We're London-based, and we had Roz from Africa giving her Ghanaian perspective in episode 1. And I think we want to continue that. And Professor Cameron's book is excellent at reminding us that humanism isn't, and also shouldn't be perceived as, and we can't let it be perceived as, a Western European export, Orientalism, colonialism. Of course, they're all, especially coming from the Indian subcontinent and my family background and ethnic background, that's certainly very prominent in our minds, and we have to be careful of that. But we have to fight against that and make sure that the stories and the contributions of the people that are relatively well known, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, as Audrey said, but also people who, within their own cultures, within Indian culture, the rationalist tradition, within the slave rebellion and Black free thought culture, even the unsung heroes and heroines in those cultures need to be prominently taught. And so education, as we know, is a very important part of any movement. So I'm really looking forward to Professor Cameron in dialogue with S.I. Martin, the event that we've got coming up. And S.I. Martin gave us a talk at the London Humanists last year, I think it was, on the history of Black free thought in Britain. And that's our own tradition and culture and history here, but it's not taught in schools at all. And there are some amazing, inspiring stories of radicals, of just stubborn people who refuse to give in to an orthodoxy that was imposed upon them. And we have stories all over the world. Arab humanists who are an excellent follow on socials, ABH, and humanists from Latin America, from Asia as well. So I think the global story of what humanism is something that I'd really like to push on this podcast. And Professor Cameron's interview was an excellent, I think, launching off point for that.
I'd also like to just add what I liked about the book also was his Professor Cameron's treatment of women and their voice. He pays particular attention to the women's voice within the various movements, and I think women's voices are always relegated to, way back in the corners, in the cheap seats. And I love the elevation that he has given the female voice, the elevation of feminism, and also highlighting the important and vital roles that they played throughout the various movements. When we look at the sort of Harlem Renaissance and coming forward, and even before that, he really does treat them with respect and kindness, and really gives them the space to show what their part. And I actually felt quite warmed by that as well, to say that the woman's voice, not just in this kind of feminist, be nice to us kind of way, but the seminal important roles that they undertook, and in challenging, and they had to challenge not just the wider idea of feminine, of women's voices, but even within their own movements, even within the Black Panthers, their voices were, trying to be quietened, and they then had to then challenge that as well. And he kind of sets that in the idea of communism, and why communism within the 20s and 30s was so appealing to Black freethinkers at the time, was because it was just, it was the way, when you're living in a country that is full of racism, communism feels like, an ideal space. And whatever we think of communism now, back at that time, Russia was or the USSR was a completely different space, and was appealing. And I enjoyed the way that he treated the whole aspect of that.
He wanted to make sure he was shining a light on as diverse a range of voices, and perhaps those stories that haven't been told as much, and that certainly stood out. And I definitely think that conversation between Chris and S.I. Martin next week is probably going to be extremely enlightening, in terms of, given both of their intellectual backgrounds and the areas that they research. I mean, this is going to be a huge collaboration to bring together the UK's story and what's happened in the US. So very much looking forward to that.
Yes, both of those. I mean, when Professor Cameron came to ABH and asked us, to put this thing together, S.I. Martin was the first person, who's also, a very important part of Association of Black Humanists. And in the interview, Professor Cameron talks about, Professor Anthony Pinn, again, someone that we have had on in ABH as well. And we really do try to get all of those voices out there, looking at Black humanism and humanism within the Black community, and all the challenges that being a Black humanist brings. And thinking of Professor Pinn, and humanism, colorblindness is not the answer. Again, that kind of highlights the challenges that we as humanists, as Black humanists, kind of face within the humanist community, and the kind of challenges that we still face. So again, it's having all of these voices coming together, and we are really grateful to Professor Cameron for coming to ABH and supporting us in getting this whole thing off the ground, and obviously CLH for being part of it. But I think our name is out there well enough for people to come forward to us now, and know that we can offer a space for people to step forward. So again, ABH is where it's happening. If you want to keep in contact with us, there'll be others that we hopefully will be able to put together in the future.
Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Audrey. Now, we mentioned last week that we are hoping in this last section to answer any of your burning questions, and we did open our mailbag. So we've had a question in this week from Fadia in Cambridge, and it's in relation to something you mentioned last week, AJ, talking about what it means to be spiritual but not religious, or humanistic spirituality. I was interested in hearing more about this and what it means to be spiritual to you and not religious. Is it just associated with mindfulness, or is it something more?
Yeah, so this is a really core aspect of my kind of thought process and my mental framework, is this idea of spirituality. And I think humanists and other free thinkers and skeptics, there is an argument for us to try and re-own or own or stake our ownership to that claim and not let it be exclusively in the realm of those of religious faith. And as we said last week in episode 1, we have to be careful of our terms here. And spirituality can be very close to spiritism or spiritualism, mediums and readings and trying to contact your, grandma from beyond the grave, etc. And for me, it's nothing to do with that. From my personal perspective, it's, as we mentioned a bit last week, it's about looking beyond the outer. So we have the spirit of the law, and then we have the letter of the law. And the idea being the letter of the law is the very sort of superficial, a very primary initial reading or understanding of something. Looking beyond that at the spirit of something is what's actually inside. And that can have many forms, looking, not judging a book by its cover, not judging a moment by just sort of the outer aspects of it or what may happen in our lives, good things, bad things, tragedies, crises, but also successes, trying not to be too carried away with the to's and fro's of life, but being, as you say, mindfulness is a big part of it, being grateful, stopping to smell the roses. Alice Roberts has talked very much about this, a previous Humanist UK president and prominent broadcaster. And there's a long, rich tradition of humanists, atheists, agnostic skeptics talking to this need for humans from a scientific point of view. Evolutionarily, we are mythical creatures in some sense. We like storytelling, we like creating narratives, we like describing, maybe in too much of an anthropomorphic way, imposing our values and concepts upon the natural world. And without taking it too seriously, as in going and believing in the supernatural, but understanding it as a part of our psychology is, I think, really important. Now, one may say, why not just call it human psychology? Why call it spirituality? Again, I'm not too wedded to the terms. Personally, I'm fine with calling it a humanistic spirituality. Indeed, that's what we call it in one of the modules of our One Life course that we teach at CLH, that we try and do yearly. And that's an introduction to humanism. One of the modules that I teach is called an everyday humanistic spirituality. And indeed, Alice Roberts and many others have used that term as well. And many other figures like Rabindranath Tagore from the Indian tradition and globally, that aspect has been recognized as a core aspect of human psychology, because that's part of our genetic endowment. That's part of the history of our species. And I think to deny that, it would be a shame. And the other part of it is it helps us better connect to people of religious faith, both from an interfaith dialogue perspective and to be part of the same society that we share, but also we can try and answer one of the points that Audrey raised before from her personal story, the accusations from others saying, well, atheists and humanists, like, you're living a half-life. You don't have a morality. You don't have a sense of awe. You don't have a sense of wonder. Where is your sort of, sense of majesty and glory that you're in this amazing world? And my answer to that would be, try watching Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Try reading, Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. There is enough wonder already. It just, in truth, is stranger than fiction, because fiction has to stick to possibilities. Truth doesn't. So we don't know what we're going to discover. So all of these senses of how we give meaning to our lives and how we situate ourselves in this universe, to me, is quite it gives me goosebumps in terms of what that perspective. And that, for me, enriches my life and gives me a sense of perspective and a meaning and a motivation when life can sometimes get quite tough. So none of what I've laid out there requires a belief in the supernatural or belief in a higher deity that's going to judge me for doing this or that act. So I think for people who do want it, and not everyone does, there is an aspect of humanism that can serve you in the buffet of all of the different benefits that humanism can offer. Humanistic spirituality is certainly there, and I think it should be valued for what it is.
And what about you, Audrey? Would you consider yourself a spiritual person?
The thing about it is, I think I've always looked at spirituality in terms of the traditional way. And so I kind of rejected it. But listening to AJ there kind of gave me a different perspective and a different connection. And I suppose it's about the labeling for me. I think there are some words, it's a bit like atheist. Some people get turned off by that word. So I think all of the things are things that, all the things that you described, AJ, are things that I, all wonder, stopping to smell the roses, are things that I consider to be part of humanism. I hadn't given it that spiritual label because of what spirituality means. And I suppose I would kind of think about, if we're going to use that, I don't know, maybe it's just the labeling for me. I understand the context, I understand all of those things. But yeah, maybe I need to explore it a little bit more and think about it in a slightly different way. So I thank you for giving me that explanation of it, because I've always just rejected spirituality, because I said to myself, I didn't quite understand what it meant in the humanist context, because for me, spirituality is the mediums. It is trying to contact Granny, which is quite scary. So I just kind of wanted to, so I think I need to kind of investigate it a little bit more and maybe consider it a little bit more, because I think it is important that we understand all aspects of human life and who we are as human beings and how we connect, not only with each other, with our communities, but with the wider world. And not in that practical, we kind of think of logic and, practicality, and we have to be more, it's sort of external to ourselves to make that connection as well, and the hope and possibilities and all the things that are, that we can't touch and hold. So I think giving an understanding of that side of things is vital to us as as humanists and as human beings. So I'm open to this idea of humanist spirituality. I'll have a look, I'll have a think, I'll kind of ponder this whole idea, and I might come back and let you know my thoughts.
Yeah, he's very convincing, isn't he?
Very.
I should also say that there is an element of privilege here as well. I don't come from a religious background, and that's very important to say. I've never belonged to a religious faith. I can consider myself quite privileged in that aspect, because I have seen that my perspective is quite privileged compared to people who have had to associate what they see as spirituality with family manipulation, with blackmail, with all kinds of trauma. So certainly we all have our own particular blind spots and biases. So I try to take account of that. And that's why I said there's room at the humanist table for people of all backgrounds in terms of their nationality, ethnicity, and also their religious background. So and there certainly is plenty of room at the humanist table for people who are very, very stern and strict with their terms and say, no, I don't want to open the door in any way to any kind of reaching across the table to meet someone halfway, and we'll come with our humanist spirituality and they can come with a religious spirituality, and we'll see sort of where the common grounds are. We'll keep our differences, we'll keep our common grounds. Many humanists do reject that, and they should feel free to reject it, because that's their lived experience. That's what they're bringing to the humanist table. And I think it's important to be clear before any discussion how we're using the terms and why we're using them. As already mentioned there, sometimes we also overvalue. I mean, humanists are often accused of being too intellectual or too philosophical or too just very intense with our academic approach to things. And I think in some senses, spirituality, and the reason why I and Alice Roberts and many other people have used that term, is just a nod to the idea that we can live a fulfilling life and have fulfilling experiences without necessarily going through the rational mill, or everything has to be logical, everything has to be sort of, there are aspects of life that do need to do that. Like if you have a medical problem, you need to approach it in a very rational way, not in a spiritual sort of hope and pray for the best kind of way. But there are other aspects of life, love, relationships, music, being lost in creative expression. These don't need to be arrived at through an intellectual path or necessarily using our IQ. We can also use our emotional intelligence in other ways. So I think that variety is what I'd like to emphasize and leave the door open to. So I'm very glad that question was asked. And hopefully we can explore this, not just through my perspective, but through other perspectives as well in future episodes.
Thank you. And if you would like to send us a question, we'll link to our email address in the show notes, and we'll be setting up our social channels soon. Well, that's everything for today. just leaves me to thank AJ and Audrey and you, listener. Now, to play us out this week, we do have another event coming up next week, our What Humanism Means to Me meets a monthly talk where we're going to be joined by a panel of our members and also a special guest speaker, poet Alex Williams. And he's been kind enough to send us in advance one of his poems. So to play us out, here is Alex Williams.
What on earth more wondrous than a hummingbird exists? Nature's glory, floating sharp, a sliver, silver in a liquid air. Purple dash flash blue of slicing vibration, mocking gravity, drinking deep the lees of floral nectar hidden from less specialized imbibers. Bobbing wonder, flit of beauty, pinnacle of process, evolutionary, cousin of all life.